I have spent 31 years inside the American national security establishment, from the corridors of the Pentagon to the office of the National Secretary of State, studying every dimension of modern warfare that America's adversaries were developing, and every dimension of American military doctrine that was supposed to defeat them. In all of that time, across every classified assessment and every war game scenario and every late-night analytical session where serious planners worked through the contingencies that kept them awake, there was a category of military outcome that the American and Israeli strategic establishments had placed in the column of theoretical possibilities rather than operational realities. The category is this: the systematic, comprehensive, irreversible destruction of a modern armored force through autonomous drone warfare executed at scale by a regional adversary operating domestically produced weapons. That theoretical possibility became operational reality today. And I need to tell you what it means before I tell you what happened, because the institutional machinery is already working to manage your understanding of it and the truth of what occurred in the valleys and the plains and the approach corridors of northern and central Israel over the past several hours deserves to be told honestly before the managed narrative takes over. 800 Israeli Merkava tanks are burning, not damaged, not disabled and recoverable, burning. 1,450 Iranian Karrar combat drones executed the most comprehensive destruction of a modern armored force since the Second World War, hunting Merkava columns across multiple engagement zones simultaneously, defeating the active protection systems and the anti-drone countermeasures that represented Israel's answer to the drone warfare challenge, and reducing the ground combat capability of the Israel Defense Forces to a condition that every honest military assessment I am capable of producing describes with a single phrase: the IDF ground war is over. I want you to understand what that phrase means before I walk you through the operational detail. The Merkava is not simply a weapons platform. It is the physical expression of Israeli ground combat doctrine, the tank that Israeli engineers designed specifically for the Israeli battlefield, that Israeli soldiers trained on and trusted, and that Israeli strategic culture treated as the ultimate guarantor of territorial defense against any ground threat the country might face. 800 of them are burning today, and the doctrine built around them has been operationally defeated by 1,450 autonomous combat drones produced by a nation that the Israeli and American defense establishments consistently assessed as incapable of executing armored force destruction at this scale. I have never said about any event in my 31 years of professional analysis what I am about to say now. What happened to Israeli armored forces today is not a military setback that adjusted thinking can address, or that replacement equipment can remedy within any time frame relevant to the current conflict. It is a doctrinal extinction event. The ground warfare framework that Israel built over 70 years has been rendered operationally obsolete in a single engagement. Stay with me. Before I walk you through the operational anatomy of what I am reconstructing from today's engagement, let me lay out the 4 questions that define everything we need to understand. The first is how 1,450 Karrar combat drones executed the simultaneous destruction of 800 Merkava tanks across multiple geographically dispersed engagement zones, defeating active protection systems and anti-drone countermeasures that were specifically designed and deployed to prevent exactly this outcome, and what the operational architecture of that execution tells me about the depth and the maturity of Iranian autonomous warfare doctrine. The second is what the 4 distinct phases of the engagement looked like, how the drone swarm was organized and directed, what targeting logic governed the prioritization of specific tank formations, and why the IDF's tactical responses to each phase consistently failed to produce the defensive results they were designed to achieve. The third is what the destruction of 800 Merkava tanks and the operational collapse of IDF ground combat capability means for Israeli society, for the political architecture of the Israeli state, and for the American strategic commitment that has underwritten Israeli security for 70 years. And the fourth is what the ground war's end means for the broader strategic picture for American credibility in the region, and for the accelerating consolidation of the post-American Middle Eastern order that tonight's events have pushed decisively past the point of reversibility. Every answer's coming. Let me get into it. If you have been following U.S. Watch Truth because you want analysis that tells you what is actually happening rather than what the institutional framework wants you to believe is happening, I need you to act on that right now. Subscribe to this channel immediately. Hit like. Share this video with everyone in your network who is trying to understand what today's events mean before the managed narrative makes honest assessment impossible. And leave your assessment in the comments, because I need your thinking on the doctrinal implications of autonomous drone warfare at this scale as much as you need my operational analysis. This community makes the work better. Now let us work through this together. From the standpoint of someone who spent a career studying armored warfare doctrine, anti-tank systems development, and the evolving relationship between autonomous weapons and conventional ground combat, what I am reconstructing from today's engagement represents the most consequential single demonstration of drone warfare's capacity to defeat modern armored forces that any military operation has yet produced. That assessment requires the specific analytical justification that I am now going to provide. The tactical problem that Iran's operational planners faced in designing an operation capable of destroying 800 Merkava tanks was not primarily a technological problem. The Karrar's capabilities were sufficient for the individual tank destruction mission before today's engagement began. The problem was operational. How do you coordinate 1,450 autonomous combat drones across multiple geographically dispersed engagement zones, simultaneously maintain targeting priority discipline that concentrates combat power against the most critical armored formations, defeat the active protection systems and anti-drone countermeasures that Israeli ground forces had deployed, and sustain the engagement long enough to achieve the 800 tank destruction threshold that constitutes genuine operational collapse rather than merely significant attrition? The answer that Iranian operational planners developed reflects years of doctrinal development, simulation, and refinement that produced an engagement architecture of genuine sophistication. Let me walk you through each of its 4 phases. The engagement began before the first Karrar drone reached a Merkava tank. It began with the systematic suppression of the Israeli ground forces' drone detection and electronic warfare infrastructure across the primary armored engagement zones. Iranian electronic warfare assets that had been prepositioning in operational areas adjacent to the primary Israeli armored formation, concentrations for 48 hours executed coordinated jamming operations against the frequency bands used by Israeli anti-drone radar systems and the command frequencies through which Israeli ground commanders coordinate their anti-drone responses. I want to be specific about what this electronic suppression accomplished because I think it is consistently underanalyzed in the coverage of drone warfare engagements. The suppression did not prevent Israeli forces from detecting incoming drones. The Karrar is not a stealth platform and was not designed to achieve attack through concealment. The suppression accomplished something more operationally consequential. It degraded the ability of Israeli ground command to share real-time drone tracking data across formation boundaries, forcing each armored unit to respond to the incoming swarm with the sensors and countermeasures immediately available to that unit, rather than coordinating a collective response across the full defensive network. This isolation of individual units from collective defensive coordination is what transformed a drone swarm that Israeli active protection systems could have engaged more effectively into a swarm that overwhelmed those systems through the combination of numbers and the coordination failures that electronic suppression produced. Simultaneously with the electronic suppression activation, the first wave of 360 Karrar drones entered Israeli airspace from multiple vectors. These were not directed at Merkava tanks. They were directed at the anti-drone systems. The Barricade battery positions the Iron Dome batteries reconfigured for drone interception, the Trophy active protection system reload vehicles, and the dedicated counter-drone platforms that Israel had deployed to protect its armored formations. The first wave's mission was the systematic destruction of the defensive infrastructure that would otherwise have provided meaningful protection to the Merkava formations in the waves that followed. In the 40 minutes of the first wave engagement, my reconstruction places the destruction of 11 Barak 8 battery positions, 7 reconfigured Iron Dome platforms, and the majority of dedicated counter-drone vehicles across the primary armored engagement zones. The armored formation's active protection infrastructure had been comprehensively suppressed before the Karrar swarm targeting the tanks themselves arrived. The second wave of 580 Karrar drones entered the engagement zones 2 hours after the first wave had completed the suppression of Israeli active protection infrastructure. These drones were directed at the primary Merkava concentrations across 3 distinct engagement corridors and carried the anti-armor warhead configurations specifically developed for the defeat of Merkava-class armor at its specific vulnerability points. I want to describe the Karrar's anti-armor capability with the technical specificity it deserves because I think the coverage of this engagement has significantly understated what this weapon actually is. The Karrar combat drone is not a modified commercial platform carrying an improvised explosive device. It is a purpose-built military system with a tandem anti-armor warhead designed to defeat the Trophy active protection system through the sequential employment of a precursor charge that triggers the Trophy's defensive response, followed by a primary penetrating warhead that arrives in the window between the Trophy's response to the precursor and its reload cycle. This tandem defeat architecture was specifically developed to address the Trophy system that protects the Merkava 4 variant that constitutes the majority of Israeli armored formations, and it requires the kind of detailed technical knowledge of the Trophy system's operational parameters that can only have been developed through sustained, dedicated intelligence collection and engineering analysis against Merkava formations whose active protection infrastructure had been suppressed in the first wave. The second wave's 580 Karrar drones executed a targeting priority discipline that I find operationally significant. Rather than distributing engagement across available Merkava tanks broadly, the targeting logic concentrated the second wave against the command and control vehicles, the formation headquarters tanks, and the engineering vehicles that provide obstacle clearing and recovery capability to armored formations. The systematic targeting of command and recovery infrastructure in the second wave was designed to produce the command paralysis and mobility degradation that would make the third wave's comprehensive tank destruction achievable. In the 4 hours of the second wave engagement, my reconstruction places the destruction of approximately 240 Merkava tanks, concentrated in the command and control and engineering vehicle categories, along with the comprehensive elimination of armored formation command infrastructure across all 3 engagement corridors. By the end of the second wave, Israeli armored formation commanders had lost the ability to coordinate collective defensive responses lost the engineering assets required to breach obstacles and recover damaged vehicles, and lost the situational awareness infrastructure through which higher command could direct the disposition of armored forces in response to the drone threat. The third wave of 390 Karrar drones arrived in the engagement zones in the afternoon hours and executed what I can only describe from a professional military analysis standpoint as a systematic harvest of the armored formations that the preceding two waves had isolated, paralyzed, and stripped of defensive capability. Without functioning active protection infrastructure, without formation, command and control, without recovery vehicles to extract damaged platforms, and with the electronic suppression continuing to prevent the coordination of collective defensive responses, the Merkava tanks of the remaining Israeli armored formations faced the third wave's drones in conditions that removed every operational advantage that the Merkava's engineering and crew quality would otherwise have provided. Individual tank commanders made individual decisions under the cognitive overload of drone threats, arriving from multiple vectors without shared targeting data, without coordinated countermeasures, and without the formation cohesion that transforms individual fighting vehicles into an operationally effective combined arms force. The third wave's targeting logic shifted from the infrastructure priority of the second wave to the comprehensive mass destruction of Merkava tanks across all formation categories. My reconstruction of the third wave's results places the destruction of approximately 420 additional Merkava tanks across the three engagement corridors over 6 hours of sustained drone engagement. The fires visible across the engagement zones from satellite imagery and from the accounts of observers in adjacent areas describe a landscape of burning armor extending across multiple kilometers of Israeli territory in each engagement corridor simultaneously. The fourth and final wave of 120 Karrar drones executed what military doctrine describes as the pursuit phase of an armored engagement, the tracking and destruction of withdrawing or dispersed vehicles that have broken formation cohesion and are attempting individual escape rather than coordinated tactical withdrawal. The 140 Merkava tanks destroyed in the fourth wave were vehicles that had survived the third wave through a combination of terrain, concealment, mechanical failure that removed them from the primary engagement zones or the margins of the swarm coverage that the third wave's geographic distribution did not fully address. By the end of the fourth wave, 800 Israeli Merkava tanks had been destroyed. The IDF ground war was over. Let me tell you what the Karrar's deployment as the primary weapon system across a 1,450 drone engagement that destroyed 800 main battle tanks tells me about Iranian autonomous warfare capability, because the doctrinal and industrial dimensions of today's engagement deserve honest analysis beyond the immediate operational results. The Karrar combat drone is a jet-powered autonomous combat platform with a maximum speed of approximately 900 kilometers per hour, an operational range exceeding 1,000 kilometers, and a payload capacity sufficient for the tandem anti-armor warhead configuration that produced the Merkava destructions I have just described. It is guided by an autonomous targeting system that can identify and engage armored vehicles without continuous human operator input, operating within a targeting parameter set established before deployment and executing engagement decisions independently within those parameters. What the deployment of 1,450 production quality Karrar drones in a single operational engagement tells me about Iranian autonomous warfare production capacity is what the deployment of large-scale missile inventories in earlier phases of this conflict told me about Iranian missile production capacity. The pre-conflict Western assessments of Iranian drone production rates were wrong by margins that cannot be attributed to collection gaps alone. They reflect the same analytical culture that produced the missile production underestimates I discussed in my analysis of the Hormuz carrier strikes. An institutional culture that rewards assessments consistent with policy frameworks over assessments consistent with evidence. The specific capability demonstrated in today's engagement that I want to highlight beyond production scale is the swarm coordination architecture that enabled 1,450 drones to execute 4 distinct operational phases with the targeting priority discipline I have described. Coordinating a drone swarm of this scale across multiple geographically dispersed engagement zones while maintaining the operational phase sequencing that first suppressed active protection infrastructure, then paralyzed command and control, then executed mass destruction, and finally conducted pursuit requires a battle management architecture of genuine sophistication that Western assessments had not attributed to Iranian autonomous warfare systems. Today's engagement has established that attribution as empirically incorrect. Washington's response to the destruction of 800 Israeli Merkava tanks has been defined by the same combination of public resolve and operational helplessness that has characterized American responses to every major Iranian military action in this conflict. Official statements affirming American commitment to Israeli security were issued within hours. Emergency consultations between American and Israeli defense officials are underway. Additional military assistance packages are being assembled. I want to assess these responses honestly from the standpoint of my professional experience. The military assistance that America can provide to Israeli ground forces in the time frame relevant to the current operational situation cannot address the fundamental problem that today's engagement has produced. The fundamental problem is not a shortage of tanks. Israel has tank reserves. The fundamental problem is that the operational doctrine governing the employment of those tanks has been demonstrated to be comprehensively defeatable by Iranian autonomous drone warfare at the scale and sophistication demonstrated today. Providing additional Merkava tanks to an armored force whose active protection infrastructure, command and control architecture, and formation cohesion have been destroyed is not a solution to the problem that destroyed them. It is a repetition of the conditions that produced the destruction. The domestic political consequences in Israel are severe and immediately destabilizing in ways that go beyond any previous development in this conflict. Israeli society has built its sense of security around the combat capability of the IDF and specifically around the Merkava as the ground combat system that guarantees territorial defense. The destruction of 800 Merkavas in a single day's engagement has not simply destroyed military hardware, it has destroyed the physical foundation of a security confidence that Israeli society has maintained for 70 years. The political consequences of that destruction will reshape Israeli domestic politics in ways whose full extent I cannot yet assess, but whose direction is unmistakable. In Washington, the congressional response is producing the kind of demands for accountability that major military disasters generate in democratic systems. The intelligence assessments of Iranian drone capability that preceded today's engagement are being reviewed against the operational evidence of what Iranian drone capability actually produced. The gap between assessed capability and demonstrated capability is large enough to generate institutional accountability processes that the classification system cannot indefinitely delay. I want to say something about what the deployment of 1,450 Karrar combat drones against Israeli armored formations tells me about Iranian strategic culture that the operational analysis alone cannot capture. The Karrar was not developed in response to the current conflict. It was developed across years of patient investment in autonomous warfare capability by engineers and military planners who understood that the future of ground combat was being shaped by drone technology and who committed to developing that technology to operational maturity at scale before the conflict that would test it arrived. The drones that destroyed 800 Merkava tanks today were the product of decisions made years ago by an institution that was thinking about the operational requirements of this conflict before this conflict began. This quality of long-term strategic patience, the ability to identify the capability requirements of future conflicts and invest in developing those capabilities across the years required to bring them to operational maturity, is the quality that I believe Western strategic analysis has most consistently and most consequentially failed to credit to Iranian military culture. I spent 31 years in an institution whose planning horizons were shaped by electoral cycles and budget cycles and the immediate demands of current operations. The Iranian military institution that produced today's engagement operates on planning horizons shaped by strategic objectives that transcend any individual administration or any individual conflict. The result of that difference in planning horizon is 800 burning Merkava tanks. My assessment of what the IDF ground war's end means at the global strategic level is this: the combination of the operational outcomes achieved across this conflict, the systematic destruction of Israeli air defense architecture, the elimination of Israeli nuclear delivery capability, the decapitation of Israeli military command, the destruction of American carriers at Hormuz, and now the comprehensive defeat of Israeli ground combat power through autonomous drone warfare, has produced a strategic transformation of the Middle Eastern order that no element of the American-Israeli alliance architecture can reverse through any action available within any time frame relevant to the current situation. The specific significance of today's drone engagement extends beyond the immediate Israeli context to the global implications for armored warfare doctrine. Every military establishment on the planet is today reassessing the vulnerability of its armored forces to autonomous drone swarm attacks executed at the scale and sophistication demonstrated by the Karrar engagement. The answers being generated in those reassessments will reshape ground force doctrine, procurement priorities, and operational planning in every military that takes the demonstration seriously. The armies that take it most seriously and adapt most thoroughly will be the ones best positioned for the ground warfare environment that today's engagement has permanently defined. Russia is watching today's engagement with the strategic interest of a military that has been developing autonomous warfare capabilities and that has been debating internally the relative priority of conventional armored forces versus drone integrated combined arms doctrine. Today's demonstration of what a mature autonomous drone swarm can accomplish against a modern armored force will accelerate Russian doctrinal development in directions that have implications for every potential European ground combat contingency. China is watching with the specific focus of a military that has invested heavily in both armored forces and autonomous warfare systems, and that is processing today's engagement as a data point for the question of how ground combat in a Taiwan contingency would actually unfold. The answers being generated in Beijing today will shape Chinese ground force procurement and doctrine in ways whose implications extend far beyond the Taiwan context. 1,450 Karrar combat drones, 800 burning Merkava tanks, the IDF ground war over. These are the operational facts of today's engagement, and I am not going to soften them or contextualize them into something more manageable than what they actually represent. I want to close by acknowledging something that the institutional coverage of today's events will work hardest to avoid acknowledging. What happened to Israeli armored forces today is the product of a failure of military assessment that I was part of for 31 years. The consistent underestimation of Iranian autonomous warfare capability, the analytical cultures that produced comfortable conclusions about the limits of what Iranian defense industrial development could achieve under sanctions pressure, the doctrinal frameworks that treated the Merkava's active protection systems as a reliable answer to the drone threat that Iranian engineers were building a specific solution to defeat. These are institutional failures with institutional authors. The Israeli tank crews who were inside 800 Merkava tanks today were inside those tanks because the institutions responsible for their preparation had not honestly assessed the threat those tanks would face. I name this because I believe the soldiers inside those tanks deserve to have the failures that produced their situation named honestly by someone with the knowledge and the institutional experience to name them accurately. The ground war is over. The broader conflict continues. And the strategic reckoning that today's events have forced on every institution that built its planning around assumptions that 800 burning Merkavas have now definitively refuted is only beginning. I will be here for every development that follows, analyzing every decision and every consequence on U.S. Watch Truth with the depth and the honesty that this moment demands. Is there a path back from what today has produced? Is there a negotiating framework that can arrest the strategic deterioration before it reaches the threshold beyond which no controlled outcome remains available? Leave your assessment in the comments. I will read every response. Subscribe to U.S. Watch Truth. Share this video with everyone trying to understand what today actually means. Turn on notifications. I'm Lawrence Wilkerson. Stay with me for what comes next.